I came home early to set out the bourbon pecan cake before my father-in-law blew out his candles. Instead, the house looked like an intentional clean-out. His oxygen machine hummed, his heart pills sat on the counter, and his coat still hung by the door. Only Elias was gone. My husband's note was colder than the January wind, saying he checked his dad into a facility and left for 3 days. It was a calculated removal. I am Aurora Collins, 34 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have made my living dissecting the wreckage of other people's lives. As a claims investigator for Stonebridge Mutual Recovery, my days are spent sifting through the charred remains of warehouse fires, tracing the labyrinthine paper trails of inflated flood damage, and looking for the exact moment a lie was born. I am trained to spot the anomaly in the mundane, to understand that the absence of an object is often louder than its presence, but I never expected to find a fabricated disaster waiting for me in my own living room. I drove into the river town of Bellport, Georgia, as the late afternoon sun cast long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. I was returning from a 3-day business trip in Atlanta, the back of my SUV heavy with the makings of a celebration. It was my father-in-law, Elias Holloway's birthday. The passenger seat held the prize, a massive bourbon pecan cake from a bakery he loved, boxed up tight with baker's twine. In the cooler behind me were 2 thick racks of barbecue ribs and a heavy sack of russet potatoes ready to be loaded with butter and chives. I had planned this dinner meticulously. Elias was getting frail. His heart condition was a ticking clock, and his lungs were following suit. I knew, with a quiet, heavy certainty, that this might be the last birthday he would have the strength to sit at the head of his own dining table. The tires crunched over the gravel of our driveway. I killed the engine and grabbed the cake box first, balancing it on one hip as I unlocked the front door. I expected the familiar scent of old wood, Elias's pipe tobacco, and the faint, metallic tang of the oxygen concentrator. I stepped inside and nudged the door shut with my heel. The house was dead quiet. It was not the peaceful quiet of an old man taking an afternoon nap. It was the sterile, hollow silence of a room that had been stripped of its purpose. I set the cake box down on the entryway console. My eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the drawn blinds, and the investigator in me instantly registered the missing pieces. The living room looked like a staged photograph where someone had deliberately erased the focal point. Elias's worn leather reading chair, the one molded perfectly to the slump of his shoulders, was gone. There was only a clean, rectangular indentation in the rug where it used to sit. Beyond that, in the hallway alcove, the bottom drawer of the heavy oak filing cabinet hung wide open, its metallic track exposed and vulnerable, the hanging folders shoved haphazardly to one side. I walked further in, my pulse beginning a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. It was not what was missing that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was what remained. On the side table, Elias's thick-lensed reading glasses sat folded neatly next to yesterday's financial newspaper. On the kitchen counter, lined up like loyal soldiers awaiting orders, were his amber prescription bottles, his beta blockers, his blood thinners, his joint supplements, and in the corner of the living room, still plugged into the wall, the large gray box of his oxygen machine hummed its steady, rhythmic drone. The plastic cannula tubing lay coiled on the hardwood floor like a dead snake. Whoever had taken him had taken the man, but they had deliberately left his survival behind. It was a physical removal, not a transfer of care. I moved to the kitchen island. A single sheet of lined notepad paper sat anchored under a ceramic salt shaker. I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. It was my husband, Wade. I picked up the paper, the edges biting into my fingertips. The words were colder than the biting January wind rattling the window panes above the sink. The note began without a greeting, skipping any pretense of affection. Wade wrote that he had checked Dad into Briar Glen Memory Residence this morning. He claimed Elias needed a more professional environment. He wrote that it had become too much of a burden, too overwhelming for us to manage here. He finished by stating he was heading up the coast for a few days to decompress and clear his head, adding a final, sharp warning not to turn this into a drama. I read the words a second time, then a third. The chill that washed over me had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with dark, sudden recognition, a more professional environment, burden, overwhelming. These were not spontaneous thoughts from a stressed son, forced into a difficult corner. These were the exact, verbatim phrases Wade had hurled at me during our heated arguments over the past 2 months. It read like a script. He had rehearsed this justification until it sounded legally sound in his own head. He had waited precisely for my 3-day absence to execute a plan that required an empty house and zero interference. The instinct of any normal wife would be to pull out her phone, dial her husband's number, and demand screaming answers. I did not reach for my phone. I knew exactly how a conversation with Wade would play out. He would adopt that low, patronizing tone. He would tell me I was being overly emotional. He would weaponize my empathy against me, insisting he made a hard, necessary choice for his father's well-being, ultimately forcing me to be the reasonable one who had to sweep up the emotional shrapnel. Wade was a master at creating catastrophic messes and walking away, leaving me holding the broom. But this was not a bounce check or a drunken argument at a neighbor's barbecue. This was a human being. This was Elias. I crushed the note in my fist, then smoothed it out against the granite countertop, realizing it was a piece of evidence. I walked over to the trash can beneath the sink to throw away a stray grocery receipt I had pulled from my pocket. As I stepped on the pedal and the lid popped open, something stiff and brightly colored caught my eye among the damp coffee grounds and crushed eggshells. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a heavy cardboard express courier envelope, completely empty. The sender's label was printed in sharp, corporate block letters, Baycrest Corridor Partners. I stared at the name, Baycrest Corridor Partners. It was a name that had never once been spoken in this house. Elias was a retired machinist who spent his days reading historical biographies and arguing with the television about corporate mergers. Wade sold mid-tier commercial insurance and complained constantly about his monthly quotas. We did not receive urgent courier deliveries from corporate partners. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavy with an implication I could not quite map out yet, but I knew the shape of fraud when I saw it. I did not collapse onto the kitchen tiles. I did not cry. The slow, methodical engine of my profession roared to life, drowning out the panic of a daughter-in-law. I took my phone out of my pocket, opened the camera application, and began to document the scene. I photographed the clean indentation in the rug where the reading chair used to be. I photographed the open filing cabinet drawer, capturing the empty spaces between the manila folders. I took extreme close-ups of the medication bottles left on the counter, making sure the prescription dates and dosages were perfectly legible. I took a picture of the humming oxygen machine and the discarded tubing. I photographed the note exactly where Wade had left it on the island, and then I photographed the Baycrest Corridor Partners envelope from every angle, making sure the tracking numbers were crystal clear. I folded Wade's note and slipped it deep into the pocket of my wool trench coat, right next to the courier envelope. I left the ribs in the cooler in the trunk of the car. I left the bourbon pecan cake sitting in its bakery box on the console. Let the meat spoil. Let the sweet frosting melt. There would be no birthday dinner tonight. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut until the deadbolt clicked into place with a definitive, heavy snap. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my SUV, threw the transmission into reverse, and backed aggressively out of the driveway. I steered the car toward the county highway, heading straight for the Briar Glen Memory residence. My intuition hammered against my ribs, loud and clear over the hum of the engine. Whatever Wade Holloway had done, he was not simply hiding a sick, failing old man to spare himself the effort of care. He was burying something else entirely, utilizing an institution as his shovel. And if I did not follow this trail immediately, a man was going to be buried alive under a mountain of legal paperwork. The automatic glass doors of Briar Glen Memory residence slid open with a synthetic hiss, exhaling a gust of aggressively climate-controlled air that hit my face like a damp towel. Walking into the lobby, I was instantly assaulted by the distinct, inescapable smell of organized apathy. It was a suffocating blend of industrial lemon floor bleach, fighting a losing battle against the sour, lingering odor of reheated meatloaf and old laundry. The lighting was overly bright, an artificial midday glare designed to keep wandering minds from realizing the sun had already gone down outside. Everything about the architecture screamed containment masquerading as care. I approached the front desk. A young woman in tight pink scrubs was aggressively chewing a piece of peppermint gum. Her eyes locked on a computer monitor. She did not look up when I stopped at the laminate counter. I gave her his name, keeping my voice flat, stripping it of any desperation. She sighed, finally clicking her mouse, and began typing. She searched for Elias Holloway with the bored, mechanical detachment of a shipping clerk trying to locate a misplaced pallet of dry goods in a massive warehouse. There was no human warmth, no recognition that she was looking up a father, a grandfather, a man who had built engines with his bare hands for 40 years. As she scrolled, I leaned slightly over the high counter. My profession had trained me to read documents upside down and sideways. I caught the bold red lettering on the digital intake form flashing across her screen before she could minimize the window. Patient Holloway. Elias. Admitting notes. Rapidly increasing confusion. Wandering behavior. Easily agitated. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. It was a perfectly constructed medical fiction, a bulletproof narrative designed to justify immediate lockup. Rapidly increasing confusion. Just 3 days ago, before I packed my bags for the Atlanta conference, this supposedly wandering, agitated old man had been sitting at my kitchen island. He had been dissecting the Wall Street Journal with surgical precision, eloquently debating the antitrust implications of a corporate railway merger over a steaming cup of black coffee. He had corrected my math on a mortgage interest calculation. There was nothing confused about Elias Holloway. Room 418. The receptionist finally droned, pointing a pen tipped with a plastic flower toward a set of heavy double doors. All the way down the east wing, last door on the left. Visiting hours technically end in 45 minutes. I pushed through the double doors and walked down the long, vinyl-floored corridor. The journey was agonizing. Doors were half open, revealing glimpses of forgotten people staring blankly at silent televisions. An alarm beeped faintly in the distance, ignored by everyone. When I reached room 418, the door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The space had been systematically stripped of human dignity. The walls were a sickening shade of beige. There were no family photographs on the nightstand, no familiar quilt brought from home to soften the institutional chill. There was only a narrow, plastic-sheeted mechanical bed and a single laminate dresser that looked like it belonged in a cheap motel. On the floor, tossed carelessly in the corner, sat a thin plastic grocery bag stuffed haphazardly with a few pairs of gray sweatpants. And sitting in a rigid vinyl armchair by the window, staring out at the darkening, rain-slicked parking lot, was Elias. He was wearing a faded hospital-issue gown over his own undershirt. On his feet were thin, treadless slippers that were clearly 2 sizes too large. His heels slipping completely out of the back with every slight movement. I scanned the room with a practiced, investigative eye. There was no oxygen concentrator humming in the corner. There was no meticulously labeled pill organizer containing the beta blockers and blood thinners, keeping his fragile heart beating in rhythm. Wade had dumped him here with less preparation than one might take to board a dog for the weekend. He turned his head slowly when I stepped fully into the room. There was no startled response, no gasp of wide-eyed relief. That was the detail that twisted the knife deepest into my gut. He was perfectly, devastatingly calm. He looked at me with the quiet, heavy resignation of a man who had already mapped out the entire geometry of this betrayal. He had known this was coming, and he had known, with absolute certainty, that I would be the only person in the world to walk through that door. "Aurora," he said. His voice was raspy, dry without the constant moisture of his home humidifier. I closed the door behind me, sealing us off from the hallway. "I am getting you out of this place right now," I said, my voice dropping to a low, furious whisper. "I am going to the desk. and I am signing whatever against medical advice discharge papers they have." Elias held up a thin, trembling hand, his knuckles swollen with arthritis. The gesture commanded absolute authority, halting me in my tracks. "Wade told the charge nurses this was just a temporary hold," Elias said, his tone devoid of any comforting allusions. "He told them it was a standard 72-hour care assessment because my breathing was acting up and he was afraid to leave me alone." "Your breathing machine is sitting plugged into our living room wall," I countered, the anger burning hot in my throat. "Your medication is lined up on the kitchen counter. He left everything you need to survive at the house." Elias offered a dry, profoundly sad smile. He did not argue. Instead, he reached a shaking hand into the collar of his heavy wool cardigan. His fingers fumbled for a few agonizing seconds before he pulled out a folded, legal-sized envelope he had tucked securely against his chest. Hiding it from the intake nurses, he held it out to me. I took the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of papers inside. It was a high-quality photocopy of a petition filed with the county probate court. The bold, capitalized header read "Emergency Petition for Appointment of Guardian and Conservator." I scanned the dates stamped in black ink across the top margin. The hearing date was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours from the moment Wade had checked him into this facility. "He had this drawn up before he even packed my grocery bag," Elias said quietly, watching my eyes dart across the legal jargon. "For the last 2 weeks, whenever you were at the office or out of town, he has been coming over to the house. He kept bringing different versions of a land access agreement. He kept pushing a pen into my hand, pacing around the kitchen, telling me I needed to sign it immediately to clear up some old, imaginary tax liabilities." I looked up from the paperwork, my mind racing to connect the disjointed pieces of evidence. The access agreement for the Bellport Marsh property. Our family had owned that tract of riverfront swamp for 3 decades. We never talked about it because there was absolutely nothing to talk about. It was 50 acres of sinking mud, aggressive mosquitoes, and rotting cypress stumps. Wade had always loudly complained about it, calling it the family curse, an unbuildable, unsellable liability that only served to drain our bank account for property taxes every single December. "It is not useless anymore, Aurora," Elias said, leaning forward slightly in the vinyl chair. The fog of illness seemed to lift, and the sharp fire of the retired machinist returned to his gray eyes. "I still read the County Planning Commission notices. Wade thinks I just look at the sports page. That swamp sits dead center on the only viable topographic route for the new inland port expansion project. They are getting ready to lay down a massive, dedicated freight rail corridor to connect the shipping docks directly to the main interstate logistics hub." The pieces clicked together in my mind with a sickening metallic finality. The crushed courier envelope sitting in the garbage can under my kitchen sink. The sender's name printed in sharp corporate block letters, Baycrest Corridor Partners. It was not an insurance client. It was an infrastructure development firm. Wade was not trying to sell a worthless patch of swamp. He was trying to quietly lease the operational rights to a logistics gold mine before the public found out. "Whoever controls my signature," Elias continued, his breathing shallow but his logic razor-sharp, "controls the easement rights for that land. We are not talking about a few $1,000s to fix a leaky roof. We are talking about life-altering capital, long-term commercial lease money, millions of dollars over the next 2 decades. It is enough money to make a man do things he would never dare say out loud." I stared back down at the emergency petition in my hands. The legal mechanism Wade was attempting to use was brutally efficient. If the probate court declared Elias legally incompetent and suffering from dementia, his signature on any document would mean absolutely nothing. Wade, stepping in as his devoted son and court-appointed conservator, would hold the proverbial pen. Wade would sign the lucrative land access agreement with Baycrest Corridor Partners. Wade would control the bank accounts where the massive lease payments were deposited. Elias looked straight at me. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a man who was watching the foundation of his entire legacy crumble, understanding exactly who had swung the sledgehammer. He delivered the final, crushing truth that would dictate every single move I made from that exact second forward. "Wade did not put me in here because I am weak," my father-in-law said, his voice steady, resolute, and echoing with the grim reality of a shattered family. "He put me in here so other people would think I am not lucid enough to say no to him." I did not wait around for the evening shift change. I walked straight back to the administrative desk and demanded a temporary medical release authorization. I cited a severe protocol failure, explicitly pointing out the absence of a complete pharmaceutical history and the lack of an assigned primary care physician on his chart. I spoke rapidly, using heavy compliance terminology, burying the clerk in liability threats before the facility could formally complete their internal evaluation process. Within 45 minutes, I had him unbuckled from their institutional wheelchair and strapped securely into the passenger seat of my vehicle. We drove back to the house in complete silence. Once we crossed the threshold, the dutiful, panicked wife evaporated. The professional claims adjuster took the wheel. I settled him onto a kitchen stool, handed him a glass of water, and went to work. A house always tells the truth if you know how to interrogate the displaced air and the scuff marks. I treated my own home like a high-value insurance loss site. I started on the front porch, crouching low to photograph the deep, aggressive tire tracks gouged into the damp grass near the steps. The wheelbase was far too wide for my husband's sedan. It was a commercial transport vehicle. Moving inside, I cross-referenced the faint indentations on the hardwood floors to map exactly how the furniture had been dragged out. I pulled up the security application on my mobile phone. The doorbell camera footage had a highly convenient 3-hour blackout window from yesterday afternoon. I checked the digital delivery log for our address and found a digitally signed receipt for an express courier envelope stamped exactly 24 hours before I walked through the door. I moved down the hallway to the guest bedroom closet. I pushed aside the heavy winter coats and pressed my hand flat against the back drywall. The hidden wall safe hung wide open, its steel door swinging loosely on the hinges. It was completely gutted. Every birth certificate, every property deed, every decade-old tax return had been wiped clean. Whoever packed up the living room had been thorough and methodical. But amateurs always miss the peripheral storage. I walked into the mudroom and dug my hands deep into the pockets of the heavy canvas hunting jacket hanging on the far peg. My fingers brushed against a piece of cold, jagged brass. It was an old, heavy key. I knew exactly which rusted padlock it belonged to. I left the house and walked out to the backyard storage shed. The hinges screamed in the quiet evening air as I pulled the door open. Hidden beneath a pile of dry-rotted canvas tarps sat a heavy steel toolbox. The brass key turned with a loud, satisfying click. Inside, there were no wrenches, no screwdrivers, no spare engine parts. There was a thick, leather-bound notebook. I carried it back into the kitchen and opened it flat on the granite island under the pendant lights. It was his handwriting. He had not been losing his mind. He had been keeping a meticulous, chronological ledger of his own slow, deliberate erasure. He had logged the exact dates and times his heart medication went suspiciously missing from the bathroom counter. He noted the specific morning his quarterly cardiology appointment was abruptly canceled without his knowledge or consent. And then came the financial records. Line by line, he had documented electronic transfers initiating from his personal savings and disappearing into an account I did not recognize. Next to each withdrawal, he had written down the fraudulent memo lines Wade had used. $3,000 for installing bathroom handrails, $4,000 for hiring a night shift nurse, $800 for purchasing mobility support equipment. I looked around the silent house. There were no steel handrails bolted to the shower tiles. There was no nurse sitting in the corner. There was no mobility equipment. The money was gone, vanished into the ether of a completely fabricated care plan designed to create a paper trail of declining health. The most damning entries, however, were not the stolen funds. On 3 separate dates, circled aggressively in red ink, he noted overhearing hushed, heated phone conversations. Immediately after he refused to sign the property access agreements, Wade had locked himself in the garage and dialed the same name, Marin. I walked over to my work briefcase, pulled out my laptop, and bypassed the shared household budget application. I logged directly into our primary credit card portal. Wade had explicitly claimed he was driving up the coast to clear his head, suffocating under the crushing, solitary weight of caregiver burnout. The pending transactions flashing across my screen told a wildly different tale of exhaustion. Just 4 hours ago, the card had been swiped at a luxury oceanfront resort on St. Simon's Island. The charges were itemized and explicit: a premium ocean view suite, 2 artisan cocktails at the lobby bar, and a heavily priced couples aromatherapy spa package. A woman named Marin, a corporate entity desperate for riverfront swampland, an exhausted husband drinking artisan cocktails on a resort island. The variables were all there. I opened a new browser tab and dove into the professional networking platforms. It took less than 10 minutes of cross-referencing Baycrest Corridor Partners to find her profile. Marin Pike. Her official corporate title read Infrastructure Strategy Consultant. I dug deeper, locating her public social media feed. Her latest photograph upload was less than an hour old. It was a perfectly filtered shot of a sunset bleeding over the Atlantic Ocean, taken from a high-floor hotel balcony. In the foreground rested 2 crystal wine glasses. Resting casually on the glass patio table, just entering the edge of the frame, was a man's forearm. Strapped tightly to the wrist was a distinct, vintage silver chronograph watch with a cracked leather band. I had purchased that exact watch for his 30th birthday. I sat back on the stool, the harsh blue light of the laptop screen washing over my face. The puzzle snapped together, forming a picture so fundamentally ugly it stole the breath right out of my lungs. This was not a tragic story of a weak man seeking emotional comfort in the arms of a stranger because his home life had become too stressful. That was a mundane, predictable marital cliché. This was a calculated corporate transaction masquerading as a family crisis. My husband was sleeping with the exact woman strategically deployed by the infrastructure firm to secure the rights to his father's land. The affair was merely the operational vehicle. The memory care facility was the administrative mechanism. Stripping a sharp, elderly man of his legal autonomy and locking him away was simply step 1 in a masterfully brutal plan to legalize the theft of a multi-million-dollar asset. The man I had married was not just a cheating spouse. He was the inside architect of a hostile takeover, and he had used my own living room as the staging ground. I did not waste time staring at the glowing screen of my laptop once the reality of the situation settled into my bones. The emotional betrayal was a secondary issue now. I needed structural defense. I picked up my phone and dialed the only number that mattered in a crisis of this magnitude. Lenora Beale had been the estate and trust attorney for the Holloway family for over 20 years. She was not the kind of lawyer who advertised on highway billboards. She was the kind of lawyer who dismantled disastrous family decisions behind closed mahogany doors. It took her exactly 45 minutes to reach the house. Lenora walked through the front door wearing a sharply tailored camel coat and sensible, low-heeled leather flats. She carried a battered leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to break a collarbone. She did not offer a sympathetic hug or a soft smile. She possessed the distinct, terrifying aura of a professional who was accustomed to handling the absolute worst of human nature with black ink and white paper. She walked straight into the kitchen, took one look at Elias sitting quietly at the island, and nodded. Then she turned to me. I handed her the photocopied petition for emergency guardianship and the crushed express envelope bearing the Baycrest Corridor Partners logo. Lenora barely glanced at the envelope before tossing it onto the granite counter. Baycrest, Lenora said, her voice dry and devoid of surprise. They have been quietly bleeding this county dry for the last 8 months. They are a proxy firm. Their entire corporate strategy relies on silently gobbling up land access agreements and right-of-way easements from working-class families around Bellport before the state officially announces the massive rail project. They keep the public in the dark to prevent the price per acre from skyrocketing. Your husband is helping them steal from his own blood. I poured Lenora a cup of black coffee. She did not touch it. Instead, she unclasped her heavy briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of bound legal documents. Wade has always treated that riverfront property like it was a mosquito-infested joke, I said, leaning against the counter. He convinced himself it was completely worthless. Lenora offered a razor-thin smile. Your husband is an idiot. That swamp is the most strategically vital piece of topography in the entire county. It does not just hold dirt. It holds 3 distinct layers of immense commercial value. She tapped the document with a perfectly manicured fingernail. First, it holds legacy riparian water rights from an old industrial barge dock that was grandfathered into the zoning laws 50 years ago. Second, the new Dryport project legally requires a massive, dedicated flood drainage corridor to get federal approval. Your father-in-law owns the exact natural basin they need to use. And third, if the logistics project breaks ground, the construction firms will require a staging yard for raw materials. That means a guaranteed commercial lease spanning a minimum of 15 years. I felt the air leave my lungs. Wade was not just trying to secure a quick payout. He was trying to hijack a multi-generational fortune. But here is the structural flaw in your husband's brilliant little scheme, Lenora continued, her tone shifting into a lethal, authoritative cadence. Wade assumes this property is registered in his father's personal name. It has not been a personal asset for a very long time. That land is legally insulated inside the Holloway Marsh Trust. It is an irrevocable family entity. Elias sat up straighter on his stool, a quiet dignity radiating from his posture. Lenora opened the bound folder. I drafted this trust specifically to protect the principal from predators. It contains a highly aggressive anti-self-dealing provision. More importantly, it features an ironclad clause regarding elder coercion. The language is absolute. If any named beneficiary attempts to manipulate the legal capacity of the grantor in order to engineer a financial windfall, that beneficiary is instantly and permanently stripped of their standing. They are disinherited by their own malicious actions. I stared at the legal text, processing the magnitude of the weapon sitting on my kitchen island. If Wade filed that guardianship petition, he was unknowingly pulling the pin on a grenade that would obliterate his own financial future. So Wade triggers his own ruin, I said, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. But who takes control of the trust if Elias is actually deemed incapacitated by the probate court, the state? Lenora finally picked up her coffee cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She looked over the rim at me, her dark eyes piercing through my exhaustion. No, the state does not get a dime, and neither does Wade. Because 1 year ago, Elias sat in my office and requested a highly specific amendment to the succession addendum. She flipped to the final page of the document and spun it around so it faced me. There, printed in stark black letters above a notarized signature, was my name, Aurora Collins. You are the legally designated successor trustee, Lenora stated flatly. In the event of medical incapacitation, or in the event of a formalized legal dispute initiated by a family member, the entire weight of the Holloway Marsh Trust transfers to your absolute executive control. My vision blurred for a fraction of a second. I looked from the document to Elias. He was watching me with an expression of profound, quiet trust. He had known Wade was circling like a vulture long before the first piece of luggage was packed. He had seen the rot spreading in his own son, and he had quietly, methodically built a fortress around me. Why, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I am just the daughter-in-law. You have a daughter. You have blood relatives. Elias reached across the cool granite and placed his rough, weathered hand over mine. The tremor in his fingers was noticeable, but his grip was surprisingly firm. I did not choose you out of pity, Aurora, he said, his voice raspy but resolute. I chose you because you are the only person who walks into this house and asks me what I want for dinner. Instead of asking me how much money I have left in the bank, you look at me like I'm a living man. Wade looks at me like I am a delayed inheritance. The weight of the responsibility settled over my shoulders like a lead blanket. I was no longer merely a wife trying to rescue her discarded father-in-law. I was the legal custodian of a massive corporate asset, standing directly between my treacherous husband and millions of dollars. Lenora closed the folder with a sharp, echoing snap that broke the emotional silence in the kitchen. She was not there to facilitate a touching family moment. She was there to prepare for war. "The narrative of the neglected, cheating husband ends right here," Lenora declared, her voice slicing through the room with surgical precision. "This is not a domestic dispute anymore. This is a hostile corporate takeover disguised as an emergency medical guardianship. Your husband is attempting to legally declare his father incompetent so he can seize the negotiation rights to a multi-million-dollar infrastructure deal." She stood up, buttoning her camel coat with quick, efficient movements. "If you want to stop him, moral outrage will not be enough," she warned, looking directly into my eyes. "The probate judge will not care about the broken marriage. They will only care about the standard of care and the medical documentation. We have to defeat Wade on two separate fronts simultaneously. We must build an impenetrable wall of evidence proving Elias is of perfectly sound mind, and we must do it before the gavel falls on that hearing. It is a battle of undeniable proof and brutal timing. The clock is ticking, Aurora, and your husband currently holds the pen." At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet hallway. It was not a courier, and it was not a neighbor. It was Bryn Holloway. Wade's younger sister stood on the porch, the pale winter light washing over her rigid posture. She was clutching a plastic-wrapped bouquet of yellow carnations so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Her demeanor was intensely guarded, a physical manifestation of a woman walking into enemy territory. It was obvious she had spent the entire 30-minute drive from her side of town rehearsing her defense. Wade had clearly reached her first. He had spun his frantic, carefully curated narrative over the phone, painting me as the hysterical, irrational wife who was actively interfering with a tragic but necessary medical intervention. He had convinced Bryn that their father was slipping away into dementia and desperately needed the professional environment that only a locked facility could provide. I opened the door and stepped aside without offering a greeting. The time for polite family pleasantries had evaporated the moment Wade abandoned his father. Bryn marched into the foyer, her chin tilted upward, entirely prepared to argue the logic of her brother's choices. But the rehearsed speech died instantly in her throat the second she turned the corner and stepped into the living room. I had spent an hour late the previous night dragging Elias's massive leather armchair out of the dusty garage where Wade had hastily shoved it, returning it to its rightful place by the window. Elias was sitting exactly where he belonged. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with the labored but rhythmic effort of a man managing a chronic heart condition, yet he looked entirely grounded. His morning medications were meticulously divided in the plastic daily organizer resting on the side table. The thin plastic oxygen tubing was looped comfortably behind his ears, delivering a steady, quiet hiss of air. When he heard her footsteps crossing the rug, Elias slowly turned his head. His gray eyes were sharp, focused, and entirely lucid. "Good morning, Bryn," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You are up early for a Saturday. Did you finally secure that promotion at the regional accounting office?" Bryn froze. The cheap plastic wrapper surrounding the carnations crinkled loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. She stared down at him, her eyes frantically searching his face for the empty, vacant, uncomprehending stare Wade had explicitly promised her was there. She found absolutely nothing but her father, present and mentally precise. The defensive narrative she had been fed began to fracture right in front of my eyes. I did not confront her with screaming accusations or emotional outbursts. I knew from years of insurance investigations that arguing with raw emotion only made people lock down and defend their initial positions. The truth required hard, undeniable documentation. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up the stark white admission form I had demanded from the Briar Glen registry desk, and placed it gently in front of her. I tapped my index finger against the clinical intake notes Wade had provided to the staff. I told her to read the highlighted section out loud. Bryn's eyes darted across the page. Her voice trembled noticeably as she read the fabricated symptoms her brother had engineered: wandering behavior, severe agitation, rapid cognitive decline. I looked at her, keeping my voice perfectly level, stripping the question of any judgment. "Bryn, look at the man sitting in that chair right now," I said. "Have you ever, in your entire life, seen your father act like that?" The yellow carnations slipped from her trembling hands, landing with a soft thud on the hardwood floor. She shook her head slowly, the defensive armor completely shattering into dust. She had walked into this house believing she was supporting a tragic but necessary healthcare decision for a failing patriarch. Now, she was staring directly at the undeniable, printed proof of a clinical lie. Before Bryn could formulate an excuse or attempt to rationalize her brother's actions, Elias spoke up from the leather armchair. "Your brother did not come here alone on Tuesday afternoon," Elias told his daughter. His tone carried the heavy, mournful weight of a parent acknowledging a child's ultimate moral failure. "Wade brought a woman with him. A total stranger to me. They stood right here in this room, and Wade pushed a heavy pen into my hand. He demanded I sign a document granting immediate land survey access to the riverfront property. When I put my reading glasses on and started going through the fine print line by line, your brother lost his temper. He started shouting, telling me I was getting too confused to understand basic legal forms anymore." Bryn's head snapped up. The remaining color drained completely from her cheeks. "A woman?" she asked, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper. "Did she have chin-length blonde hair? Was she wearing a tailored navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio?" Elias nodded slowly. "Yes." She did not say a single word the entire time they were here. She just stood silently by the front door, watching my hands to see if I would sign the paper. Bryn let out a ragged, uneven breath and sank heavily onto the edge of the living room sofa. She looked physically ill, as if the floor had suddenly dropped away beneath her. "Marin Pike," Bryn muttered, staring blankly at her empty hands resting in her lap. I stepped forward, genuinely surprised by the revelation. I asked Bryn how she knew the name of the infrastructure consultant. Bryn rubbed her temples forcefully, the overwhelming guilt washing over her features and aging her 10 years in a matter of seconds. "I saw them together," she confessed, her voice breaking. 3 weeks ago, I was at the county library fundraiser downtown. Wade was sitting at a dimly lit corner table in the courtyard, leaning in close, talking quietly with her. When I walked over to say hello, he jumped up like he had been caught stealing from a cash register. He introduced her as Marin, a project partner from his insurance firm. He told me they were just discussing the logistics of a difficult commercial claim. The betrayal was no longer merely a legal concept sitting on my kitchen counter. It had infected the family bloodline. Bryn was connecting the scattered dots, realizing her own brother had used her as a blind pawn in his corporate game. Her transformation was not triggered by a dramatic, persuasive speech from me. It came from a slow, creeping, suffocating shame. She was looking at the father who had raised them, who had paid for her college tuition and walked her down the aisle, realizing her brother viewed him as nothing more than an expiring asset waiting to be transferred to the highest bidder. The sheer indignity of it broke her heart. Tears welled up in Bryn's eyes, spilling over her lashes and running down her pale cheeks. She looked up at me, the devastation in her expression complete. "I have to tell you something terrible," she whispered, her throat tight with unshed sobs. "Wade called me 5 days ago. He asked me for a massive favor. He told me he was getting ready to file some protective healthcare paperwork to secure Dad's savings from being drained by medical costs. He asked me if I would be willing to stand up in front of a probate judge and testify that Dad had been acting forgetful lately. He wanted me to explicitly tell the court that Dad was getting panicky, leaving the stove on, and losing his grip on reality." She buried her face in her hands, a dry sob escaping her chest. I agreed to do it. I told him I would back him up. I trusted my brother. I did not understand the severity of the trap he was actually building. I sat down next to her on the sofa. I did not offer her empty platitudes. I did not tell her it was okay, because it was absolutely not okay. But she was finally standing on the right side of the battlefield, and I needed her clarity more than her apologies. Bryn wiped her face violently with the back of her sleeve. her expression hardening into a fierce, protective resolve. The tears stopped. She reached deep into her coat pocket, pulled out her mobile phone, and unlocked the digital screen. She scrolled quickly through her text messages for a few agonizing seconds before handing the device directly to me. "I am not testifying for him," Bryn stated, her voice finally finding a bedrock of strength. "I am standing with you." I looked down at the glowing screen. It was a message Wade had sent her late last night, right after he discovered the memory care facility was empty. The text read, "Just hold your nerve and stick to the story. I just need to get this guardianship done before the transit corridor file goes public, and everything will be fine." I stared at the glowing letters. It was the final, undeniable nail in the coffin. It was written, time-stamped proof of malicious intent, familial coercion, and calculated timeline manipulation. The brother who had asked for her blind loyalty was dead and gone. In his place stood a desperate man who had grossly miscalculated the moral compass of his own sister, handing us the exact weapon we needed to destroy his case. I walked back through the sliding glass doors of Briar Glen Memory Residence just after the morning shift change, but I was no longer the frantic, confused relative trying to locate a missing family member. I was the legally designated healthcare proxy, armed with a notarized document and absolute, uncompromising focus. I bypassed the polite waiting area and marched directly to the primary administrative desk. I slammed the proxy paperwork onto the laminate counter and demanded complete, unredacted copies of his medication administration record, the nursing observation logs, and the initial physician intake assessment. The day shift supervisor attempted to stall the process, reciting a rehearsed speech about standard privacy policies and internal review procedures. I did not raise my voice. I simply leaned forward, recited the exact state statutes regarding proxy rights, and explicitly outlined the medical board violations I would file before lunch if the documents were not in my hands. The heavy printed file materialized within 20 minutes. I took the thick stack of papers to a small plastic table in a secluded visitor alcove near the vending machines. The procedural thrill of a high-stakes fraud investigation took over my nervous system. I began cross-referencing the intake timestamps against the scheduled nursing rounds, searching for the structural anomaly. I found the glaring discrepancy on page 4 of the medical history section. During the 12 hours Elias was confined to room 418, a specific prescription order was placed for a mild benzodiazepine sedative. The prescribing signature did not belong to a staff physician on the floor. It was authorized through a third-party telehealth service by an on-call doctor who had never actually laid eyes on my father-in-law, never listened to his heart, and never evaluated his cognitive baseline. The clinical justification typed in the margin read, "severe restlessness and highly uncooperative behavior." They were not treating a medical condition. They were chemically manufacturing the exact symptoms of dementia Wade needed to present at his emergency probate hearing. As I was using my pen to aggressively circle the telehealth physician's digital signature, a young woman in light blue scrubs walked past my table, paused abruptly, and then doubled back. Her plastic name tag read, Tessa Grady, night shift charge nurse. She glanced nervously down the corridor, checking the position of the overhead security camera, before leaning in close to pretend she was wiping a non-existent coffee spill off my table. She whispered that the old man in room 418 was never aggressive or confused. She told me Elias had spent the entire night sitting rigidly in his vinyl chair, completely refusing the generic dinner tray, and calmly, repeatedly demanding access to a telephone so he could contact his legal counsel. He had absolutely refused to sign the standard facility liability waivers Wade had left at the registry desk. Tessa explained, her voice trembling slightly with guilt, that the facility management had explicitly instructed the floor staff to document his coherent legal requests as paranoid agitation in order to legally justify the administration of the sedative order. The revelation of medical sabotage was chilling, but the financial billing statement attached to the very back of the folder exposed the true mechanical scope of the operation. Standard residential admissions require a standard security deposit drawn from a personal checking account. Elias's ledger, however, showed a massive expedited wire transfers securely logged under a category labeled Priority Care Contribution. I recognized the routing sequence structure from my years investigating commercial claims. It was not drawn from our joint household bank account. I pulled out my mobile phone and ran a rapid corporate registry search on the originating limited liability company. The shell company traced directly back to a subsidiary holding firm registered under Baycrest Corridor Partners. It was highly unusual, bordering on entirely illegal, for a corporate infrastructure developer to secretly fund an elderly man's private memory care admission. Briar Glen was not just passively complicit in a family dispute, they were actively on the corporate payroll. I needed a physical, undeniable connection to link the corporate money directly to the medical fraud that occurred inside the building. I walked outside into the crisp morning air, got into the driver's seat of my vehicle, and booted up my laptop. I tapped into the county's public traffic camera database, pulling the feed from the intersection directly facing the Briar Glen parking lot entrance. I isolated the footage from the exact night Elias was admitted. I matched the digital timestamps from the medical chart against the video feed timeline. Exactly 17 minutes before the telehealth doctor digitally signed the order, declaring Elias hopelessly uncooperative, a sleek black sedan pulled into the visitor parking zone. Maren Pike stepped out of the vehicle into the harsh yellow glow of the sodium streetlights. She walked confidently through the front doors, carrying a heavy leather portfolio. She was not just Wade's mistress. She was the one directly orchestrating the intake narrative on behalf of the infrastructure firm. I called Lenora Beale immediately from the parking lot. The seasoned attorney did not waste a single breath expressing shock or outrage. She absorbed the information and shifted instantly into offensive legal maneuvers. Before I even turned the ignition key to drive home, she had already drafted an emergency data preservation letter to formally serve the Briar Glen administration, legally freezing all their internal emails, security camera footage, and third-party billing communications. Simultaneously, she initiated a high-priority report with the County Adult Protective Services Division, citing clearly documented evidence of severe financial exploitation and improper, non-consensual chemical restraints. We were dropping a massive legal anvil on the entire facility before they could shred a single document. But as I flipped back through the physical file one last time to verify the admission hour, a small, densely typed box on the primary emergency contact page caught my eye and made the blood freeze in my veins. My name, Aurora Collins, was listed as the secondary contact right beneath Wade, but next to my phone number, someone had typed a custom administrative warning flag. It read separated spouse, extremely financially motivated. Do not disclose patient location or medical status under any circumstances. The air in the car suddenly felt dangerously thin. That single line of text completely reframed the entire battlefield. This was not merely a desperate, exhausted husband improvising a sloppy plan to steal a piece of land. Wade had methodically poisoned the well long before I even suspected a leak in my marriage. He had meticulously prepared a fictitious narrative to completely invalidate my voice with the medical staff, portraying me as a greedy, estranged wife who was only looking for a quick payout. I realized with a sickening clarity that I was no longer dealing with an ungrateful partner making bad choices. I was standing directly in the crosshairs of a highly coordinated, ruthless group of professionals. I was facing a cheating husband, a corporate strategist, a complicit medical facility, and a compromised telehealth doctor, all sharing the exact same financial motive. They were working flawlessly together to systematically strip a lucid, intelligent old man of his mind and his basic human rights, turning his entire life into a profitable legal fiction. The heavy, ironclad temporary protective order secured by Lenora Beale wrapped around our house like a fortress wall. Wade was legally barred from the premises, and the administration at Briar Glen was entirely paralyzed by our aggressive data preservation mandates. For the first time in nearly a week, the suffocating pressure of ticking clocks and looming legal threats lifted, leaving behind the quiet, steady rhythm of a home trying to heal. Elias was not going back to that sterile room. I decided right then, standing in the middle of the hallway, that we were going to have the birthday dinner I had meticulously planned 3 days ago. I was going to put the patriarch of the Holloway family exactly where he belonged, at the head of his own dining table, surrounded by the warmth of actual care. The kitchen, which had recently felt like a cold staging ground for a crime scene, began to smell like a sanctuary. I tied my apron tight and focused on the tactile, grounding comfort of cooking. I pulled out the heavy cast-iron skillet and baked a thick pan of honey butter cornbread, ensuring the edges were perfectly crisp and golden. On the back burner, a large enamel pot of gumbo simmered slowly. It was a dark, rich roux that I had carefully built using the exact handwritten recipe passed down from my late mother-in-law, June Holloway. The scent of celery, onions, and bell peppers filled the air, pushing out the lingering phantom smells of industrial bleach and hospital vinyl. Bryn stood by the kitchen island, her eyes still rimmed with a raw, apologetic red. She moved awkwardly in the space, heavily burdened by the immense shame of her near complicity, but she fiercely insisted on helping. She carefully placed the wax candles into the thick, sweet frosting of the bourbon pecan cake we had rescued from the car. Her hands unsteady, but determined to contribute to the restoration of our family dignity. When the food was finally ready, we guided Elias to his heavy oak chair at the head of the long dining table. The ambient glow of the dining room chandelier cast warm, forgiving light across his weathered face. He looked at the steaming bowls of gumbo, the fresh cornbread, and the two women sitting on either side of him. He did not look like a frail, confused ward of the state waiting for a padded cell. He looked like a king who had successfully reclaimed his castle. Halfway through the meal, after the tense, exhausted silence had melted into a quiet, shared grief, Elias finally spoke about the root of the entire war. For the first time in the 7 years I had been married into this family, he told us the true history of the riverfront land. He set his spoon down, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and looked directly at me. He explained that he bought those 50 acres of swamp right after a devastating hurricane tore through the coast in the fall of 1998. Everyone in town, including his own wife, thought he had completely lost his mind. They saw nothing but a worthless tract of deep, sinking mud, aggressive mosquitoes, and shattered cypress trees. But Elias had spent his entire life working on complex engines and studying structural blueprints. He did not look at the mud. He saw the natural water lines. He saw the exact proximity to the deep river channels, and he mapped out the future commercial freight routes in his head. He knew, decades before the corporate developers ever looked at a county zoning map, that one day the logistics industry would absolutely need that exact basin to connect the coastal port to the mainland interstate. His voice grew thick with a profound sorrow that had absolutely nothing to do with real estate or bank accounts. He looked down at his calloused, trembling hands. He confessed that he had watched Wade change fundamentally over the past 10 years. He saw his son's ambition curdle into a toxic, impatient greed. Elias admitted that his own greatest failure as a father was his willful, stubborn blindness. He thought the absolute worst Wade would ever do was lie to his wife to cover his tracks, or quietly skim small amounts of cash from the joint checking accounts to fund his superficial resort lifestyle. Elias believed the moral decay had a hard limit. He never, in his darkest nightmares, imagined his own flesh and blood would aggressively push him into a locked psychiatric ward just to forge a legal signature. Elias reached into the breast pocket of his heavy wool cardigan and pulled out a small, sealed ivory envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age and smelled faintly of lavender. He slid it across the polished wood table toward me. He told me it was a private letter from June, written just a few months before her fragile heart finally gave out. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the delicate paper. June's elegant, sweeping cursive filled the page. She wrote extensively about her deep fears for Wade, about his tragic inability to find peace or satisfaction in what he already possessed. But the final paragraph was directed outward, looking toward the distant future of the house itself. She wrote that if, one day, there was a person standing in this home who instinctively remembered that providing care was infinitely more important than claiming ownership, that person would likely not carry the Holloway name by blood. However, that person would be the one holding the true, enduring soul of the family. I read the words twice, the dark ink blurring as a hot tear slipped down my cheek and hit my collar. Elias had not just chosen me as a legal trustee out of convenience. He and June had recognized me as the actual, spiritual heir to their legacy. We cleared the dinner plates, but the evening's critical work was not quite finished. Lenora Beale arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, carrying a high-definition digital camera and a portable aluminum tripod. The emotional warmth of the dinner seamlessly transitioned into a cold, ironclad legal procedure. Lenora set up the recording equipment at the far end of the table, framing Elias perfectly against the backdrop of his own living room. She hit the red record button. Elias sat up incredibly straight, refusing to lean back against the chair, staring directly into the glass lens. In a clear, unwavering voice, he stated his full legal name, the exact date, the current time, and his residential address. He formally declared his absolute legal capacity and his final, unalterable will regarding the Holloway Marsh Trust. He looked into the camera as if he were looking directly into Wade's cowardly eyes. He explicitly dictated that if Wade continued to pursue any form of medical coercion, or if he pushed forward with the fraudulent guardianship hearing, Wade would be permanently and entirely stripped of any executive control or financial benefit from the trust forever. Then, Elias delivered a final, stunning revelation that even Lenora herself had only vaguely suspected. He revealed that the true value of the trust was not just the initial land sale or the legacy water rights. Hidden deep within the original property deed was an aggressive revenue-sharing clause regarding raw materials. If any commercial infrastructure project utilized his specific acreage as a materials transit yard, the trust was legally entitled to a fixed percentage of the gross transit revenue for every single ton of freight moved across the dirt. Wade was not merely trying to secure a quick, multi-million-dollar buyout from Baycrest Corridor Partners. Wade was actively trying to hijack a continuous, generational royalty stream that would pay out massive dividends over the next 15 to 20 years. It was an absolute empire of wealth, and Wade had been entirely willing to bury his father alive to wear the crown. Lenora stopped the recording, her expression one of deep, predatory professional satisfaction. We had the ultimate weapon locked securely on a digital memory card. Bryn walked back into the dining room carrying the bourbon pecan cake. The small flames of the wax candles flickered, casting a dancing, hopeful light across the dark wood table. We did not sing the traditional birthday song. The moment was far too heavy, too profound for cheerful, ringing melodies. I placed the cake directly in front of Elias. He looked at the glowing candles for a long time. He looked at Bryn, whose face was a complex mixture of absolute grief and a fierce, unyielding new loyalty. Then he looked at me. He placed his rough, trembling hand over mine one more time, the warm firelight reflected in his clear, unbroken eyes. He leaned forward slightly, the gravity of the entire week settling into his posture. "You are not the first person in this life to promise to take care of me," Elias said, his voice dropping to a quiet, resonant register that filled every corner of the room. "But you are the first person who actually came back." He took a deep, deliberate breath, his damaged lungs working hard but remaining incredibly steady, and with a single, forceful exhale, he blew out every single candle on the cake. The heavy oak front door swung open at exactly 10 o'clock the following morning. Wade did not burst into the house like a frantic son desperate to find his missing father. He walked inside with the measured, deliberate stride of a mid-level corporate manager arriving to de-escalate a minor human resources dispute. He was wearing a sharply pressed linen shirt and a lightweight cashmere sweater draped effortlessly over his shoulders. He looked incredibly rested for a man allegedly suffering from severe caregiver burnout. He had clearly received a panicked phone call from the Briar Glen administration informing him that his medical hold had been legally overridden, and he had raced back from the coast to plug the leak in his sinking ship. "Aurora," Wade called out from the foyer. his voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing blend of manufactured worry and gentle reprimand. "Honey, we need to talk. I know you are upset, but pulling Dad out of a secure medical environment without consulting his primary physician is incredibly dangerous." He rounded the corner and stepped into the formal dining room, the practiced mask of the weary but responsible patriarch firmly affixed to his face. He expected to find me pacing the floor in tears, overwhelmed by the burden of care, ready to be manipulated back into submission. Instead, he found a tribunal. I was seated at the head of the long mahogany table. Lenora Beale sat to my right, her posture impeccably rigid, her hands resting calmly on a thick stack of legal briefs. Bryn was standing by the large bay window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on her older brother with an expression of profound, sickening disgust. Elias was resting in the adjacent living room, safely out of the immediate line of fire but well within earshot, the gentle hiss of his oxygen concentrator providing a steady rhythm to the tense silence in the room. Wade stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted from the unfamiliar attorney to his estranged sister, and finally to the meticulously organized grid of documents spread across the table. I watched the microscopic muscle spasms in his jaw as his brain rapidly processed the hostile architecture of the room. The board had been entirely flipped. He was no longer the sole narrator of this family tragedy. A lesser man might have panicked, perhaps stammering out a fragile excuse or retreating toward the front door, but Wade was a seasoned salesman. He instantly recalibrated, pivoting from the concerned caregiver to the righteous victim. "I cannot believe you are doing this," Wade said, lowering his voice to a tone of profound, wounded disappointment. "I leave for 2 days to preserve my own mental health, and you orchestrate a kidnapping. You dragged a sick, confused old man out of a specialized medical facility, and now you are bringing in outside lawyers to turn my own family against me. This is exactly the kind of hysterical overreaction that makes it impossible to manage his care." I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The woman who used to absorb his emotional shrapnel and apologize for his messes had been entirely eradicated over the last 48 hours. I simply reached forward and slid the first piece of glossy photographic evidence across the smooth wood. "This is a photograph of the hidden wall safe in the guest bedroom," I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection, echoing the sterile delivery of an insurance adjuster presenting a denied claim. "It was emptied entirely less than 2 hours before you drove your father to the facility." I slid the next document forward. "This is our joint credit card statement. It shows a clearing transaction for $850 at a luxury oceanfront resort on St. Simon's Island, swiped exactly 3 hours after you checked your father into a locked memory ward. The receipt itemizes 2 artisan cocktails and a 90-minute couples massage." Wade stiffened, his polished veneer beginning to crack around the edges. I pushed the final piece of paper toward the edge of the table. It was the heavily annotated intake form. "And this is the initial assessment from Briar Glen, where you explicitly instructed the nursing staff to record his behavior as aggressively uncooperative, creating a fraudulent medical pretext to administer chemical sedatives without his consent." Wade stared at the papers, his mind desperately calculating a new angle of deflection. He placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward, attempting to physically dominate the space. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Aurora," he hissed, the polite facade finally burning away to reveal the desperate greed underneath. "You do not understand the sheer scale of the financial liability we are facing. Dad is hoarding a massive, rotting asset that is draining our accounts. If we do not step in right now and secure legal control over his estate, the county people are going to lock down the transit corridor first, and we will be left with absolutely nothing but tax debt." The silence that followed his statement was heavier than lead. Wade had spent his entire life successfully talking his way out of corners, but his profound arrogance had finally outpaced his intellect. In his desperate attempt to justify his actions, he had just publicly confirmed his motive. Bryn pushed herself away from the bay window and took 2 steps toward the table, Her voice was terrifyingly quiet. "What transit corridor?" "Wade?" Wade froze. He looked at his younger sister, genuine panic finally breaking through his eyes. "What rail spur are you talking about?" Bryn demanded, her tone sharpening into a blade. "Because the County Planning Board has not announced any infrastructure developments for the Bellport riverfront. That information is not public. So how do you know about a transit corridor?" For the first, satisfying time in his entire adult life, Wade Holloway did not have a single coherent lie ready on his tongue. He opened his mouth, closed it, and stared at the floor. Right at that exact second, the cell phone in Wade's front trouser pocket began to vibrate aggressively. He pulled it out, glancing at the caller identification. The color drained completely from his face. It was Maren Pike. She was undoubtedly calling to report that Briar Glen was under legal lockdown and the County Protective Services had frozen their priority care contribution account. Wade jammed his thumb against the screen to silence the call, shoved the phone back into his pocket, and backed away from the table. "I need to take this," he muttered, pointing toward the front door. "It is a client emergency. I am stepping out to the porch." He practically fled down the hallway, pulling the heavy front door shut behind him to secure his privacy. He thought he was escaping the tribunal. He had completely forgotten who installed the security system. I calmly reached over to my laptop, opened the digital application for the doorbell camera, and turned the volume on the external speakers all the way up. The high-definition audio feed captured the sound of Wade pacing frantically across the wooden porch boards. We heard the distinct chime of an outgoing call connecting. "Listen to me," Wade's voice barked through the laptop speakers, completely stripped of its usual smooth charm, reduced to the guttural panic of a cornered animal. "I do not care about the data preservation letter. You told me your legal team could block any interference. I did the dirty work. I put him in the facility. Do not pull out now. You promised me the first lease installment the second the guardianship cleared." I pressed the mute button, cutting off his frantic pleading. The absolute confirmation of his conspiracy echoed against the dining room walls. Less than 2 minutes later, Wade walked back inside, attempting to arrange his features into a mask of mild annoyance. He walked back to the table, completely unaware that we had just listened to his full confession. "Look, we can sort this out," Wade began, offering a tight, artificial smile. "We just need to sit down without the lawyers and handle this as a family." Lenora Beale stood up slowly, her sensible low heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not look at him like a human being. She looked at him like a pest she had been hired to exterminate. She picked up 3 thick manila envelopes and thrust them directly against his chest. He reflexively brought his hands up to catch them. "These are not invitations to a family meeting, Mr. Holloway," Lenora stated, her voice slicing through his remaining confidence like a scalpel. "The first envelope contains a temporary restraining order issued by the county probate judge, legally barring you from accessing, altering, or discussing any assets held within the Holloway Marsh Trust. The second envelope is a formalized notice of data preservation, which means if you delete a single text message on that phone you just used on the porch, you will face federal evidence tampering charges." Lenora paused, allowing the legal reality to crush his lungs, before pointing to the final envelope. "And the third document is a courtesy copy. Your wife will be filing the official petition for legal separation first thing Monday morning, accompanied by a comprehensive demand for total financial severance." Wade stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching the thick manila envelopes against his chest like a useless shield. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, vacant, and filled with a stark, terrifying realization. He was looking at me as if I were a complete stranger who had somehow broken into his house and stolen his life. He finally understood that the compliant, forgiving woman he had married no longer existed. The woman who had spent 7 years cleaning up his financial disasters, smoothing over his careless mistakes, and believing his endless stream of hollow apologies was dead and buried. Standing in front of him now was a professional investigator who had taken every single lie he had ever told, documented every broken promise, and forged them into a weapon. I did not need to scream, and I did not need to cry. I was simply sitting in the quiet aftermath, recording his every word, ready to use them exactly when the time was right. The weekend evaporated into a breathless, grueling sprint against the clock. The county probate court flatly refused our preliminary motions to delay the emergency guardianship proceedings, locking us into a Monday morning showdown on the judge's docket. This scheduling was not an administrative coincidence. I realized exactly why Wade had pushed the legal throttle to the floor, forcing a rushed hearing. Later that exact same Monday afternoon, the County Planning Board was scheduled to formally receive the sealed zoning files regarding the massive new transport corridor. The two critical timestamps aligned perfectly. If my husband secured conservatorship over his father by noon, he could legally sign the land access agreement before the sun went down, binding the estate to the infrastructure firm just hours before the project became public knowledge. He had calculated the theft down to the very hour, leaving absolutely no margin for error. In his pre-hearing filings to the court, Wade submitted a cherry-picked, isolated cognitive evaluation from 8 months ago. It was a routine clinic screening where Elias had temporarily struggled to recall a specific sequence of words solely because he was suffering from a severe sinus infection and a high fever. The attending nurse had noted the illness, but Wade conveniently omitted that crucial context from his submission. He was trying to weaponize a brief moment of physical sickness to legally prove his father showed early signs of impaired decision-making. Lenora Beale did not flinch. She struck back with overwhelming force, immediately filing counter-motions containing 2 brand-new, highly comprehensive psychiatric evaluations. These were conducted over the weekend by independent geriatric specialists, both unequivocally declaring Elias to be exceptionally sharp and fully capable of managing his own affairs. To cement the defense, she formally submitted the sworn video declaration we had filmed right after the birthday dinner, establishing his undeniable, lucid intent to immediately revoke all of Wade's access to the family trust. While Lenora handled the dense legal filings, I stepped fully back into my professional element and built a physical timeline. I turned the formal dining room wall into an insurance fraud investigation board. I used sharp pushpins and thick red string, visually mapping out every single lie. I pinned the bank withdrawal receipts showing thousands of dollars missing right next to the exact dates Wade secretly canceled the cardiology appointments. I drew a thick black marker line connecting the specific hour he checked his father into the locked memory care facility to the geolocation pings from his mobile phone, proving he drove straight from the clinic to the luxury island resort. I tacked up the credit card statements showing the expensive couple's spa package, linking those charges directly to his itemized phone records, detailing frantic outbound calls to Marin Pike. Finally, I pinned the parking lot surveillance still of Marin arriving at the medical center just 17 minutes before the forced sedative order was signed. The wall was no longer a string of unfortunate domestic misunderstandings. It was a brilliantly illuminated, inescapable roadmap of predatory financial motive. As the clock ticked down, the unpredictable variables suddenly began tipping heavily in our favor. My phone rang late Sunday evening. It was Tessa Grady, the night shift nurse from the Briar Glen Memory Care Unit. Her voice was shaking violently through the receiver. She was terrified of professional retaliation and losing her nursing license, but her fundamental conscience had finally broken through her corporate fear. She agreed to testify as a hostile witness if absolutely necessary, provided Lenora could legally shield her identity to the maximum extent allowed by the court. She was prepared to swear under oath that Elias was deliberately mischaracterized on his intake chart to legally justify the use of chemical restraints. It was a massive piece of live ammunition I never thought we would actually secure. The fractured family front completely collapsed next. Bryn marched into the kitchen Sunday night, her face pale and her jaw set with furious determination, and slapped her mobile phone onto the granite counter. She had received a frantic, unhinged voicemail from Wade late the previous evening, right after he realized his plan was falling apart. She played the audio file on speakerphone. His voice was breathless, panicked, and entirely stripped of the dutiful son persona he had carefully cultivated. He yelled directly into the receiver, aggressively telling his sister that it did not matter if their father signed the paperwork or not, as long as the judge believed the old man was no longer sound of mind. The kitchen fell into a stunned silence as the recording ended. That single recorded sentence obliterated the entire illusion that he was acting for the benefit of his father's declining health. He had explicitly confessed to manufacturing a medical crisis to bypass legal consent. The final physical puzzle piece arrived unexpectedly from across the street. Darlene Voss, an 80-year-old neighbor who spent her days tending her rose bushes and monitoring the neighborhood like a hawk, knocked firmly on our front door. She handed me a small digital storage drive without a word of small talk. She explained that she had recently installed high-definition security cameras pointing toward the street to monitor package deliveries. She had noticed highly unusual activity at our house the exact night I left for my business trip to Atlanta. We plugged the drive into my laptop. The crisp infrared video footage clearly showed Wade and two unidentified men carrying heavy cardboard file boxes out of our front door and loading them into a rented moving truck under the cover of darkness. He was physically gutting the estate documents before the ink on the guardianship petition was even dry. But Lenora was the one who uncovered the most devastating financial twist of the entire weekend. She had spent 2 days aggressively tearing through Wade's recent banking activities, utilizing her extensive network of forensic accountants. She discovered that Wade had not merely planned to get rich from the land deal. He had already spent the phantom money. He had taken a highly confidential future revenue projection drafted by Baycrest Corridor Partners and used it to secure a massive personal bridge loan from a small, aggressive regional bank. He had leveraged his father's stolen land to float hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to cover his failing insurance sales quotas and his wildly expensive coastal getaways with his mistress. He was financially drowning, and the Monday morning guardianship hearing was the only thing keeping him from total bankruptcy and potential wire fraud charges. The absolute killing blow arrived late Sunday night, just 12 hours before we were scheduled to walk into the courtroom. A sympathetic clerk at the county planning office anonymously leaked the finalized zoning map for the transit corridor a few hours early. Lenora printed the massive schematic and unrolled it across the dining room table, weighing the corners down with coffee mugs. We traced the thick red lines indicating the proposed commercial rail path. The route carved directly through the Bellport wetlands, but it was not just a passing stretch of dirt. Elias's 50 acres of swamp sat precisely at the geographical choke point. It was the absolute lock gate of the entire logistics project. The marshland was bordered by a federally protected state wildlife reserve on the left side and a steep, structurally unstable bedrock ridge on the right side. There was absolutely no alternate route for the heavy freight trains. If Baycrest Corridor Partners did not secure the surface rights to the Holloway property, the entire multi-billion-dollar railway expansion would have to be completely redesigned from scratch, delaying the project for years and costing the developers millions in penalties. Wade was not just stealing a piece of land to sell to the highest bidder. He was attempting to hand over the absolute keystone of a regional economic empire for a fraction of its true, staggering worth, just to clear his own petty, pathetic debts. The sheer scale of his betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I looked at the timeline meticulously constructed on the wall, the sworn depositions stacked on the table, and the explosive county map resting under my hands. We were not just walking into a tragic family dispute tomorrow morning. We were walking in to detonate a massive corporate conspiracy, and we were holding all the matches. The small, wood-paneled county probate courtroom smelled of floor wax and old paper. The air was thick with the suffocating tension of a family tearing itself apart under oath. Wade arrived precisely on time, dressed in a conservatively tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly combed. He took his seat at the petitioner's table and immediately adopted the posture of a heartbroken, exhausted son. When the magistrate asked for his opening statement, Wade spoke with a carefully modulated, trembling voice. He claimed he was standing there solely to protect his father from undue influence during a period of rapidly failing health. It was a masterful, sickening performance of manufactured grief. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Elias walked down the center aisle. The court bailiff immediately rushed forward with a standard-issue aluminum wheelchair, but my father-in-law waved it away with a sharp flick of his wrist. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, but his posture was ramrod straight. He took the witness stand, placed his hands firmly on the wooden railing, and looked directly at the magistrate. Without waiting for a prompt, he stated his full legal name, his date of birth, his current residential address, and the exact day of the week. He answered the initial baseline cognitive questions with such dry, articulate precision that the magistrate physically leaned back in his leather chair, peering over his reading glasses. The narrative of a confused, wandering old man evaporated the second Elias opened his mouth. Lenora Beale did not give the opposition a single second to recover. She stood up, buttoned her blazer, and unleashed a torrent of undeniable documentation. She formally submitted the high-definition video of Elias perfectly articulating his legal capacity. She handed the judge the certified copy of the Holloway Marsh Trust, loudly highlighting the irrevocable anti-coercion clause. She laid out the bank withdrawal statements, the missing medication logs, and the highly ambiguous chemical restraint order signed by the remote physician. She ended her initial barrage by dropping the corporate banking trace, proving the memory care facility had accepted a priority admission fee directly from a shell company linked to Baycrest Corridor Partners. I was called to the stand next. I did not speak like an aggrieved, emotional wife. I spoke exactly like a senior claims investigator dismantling a massive insurance fraud ring. I presented the physical timeline. I walked the magistrate through the chronological sequence of events, turning a series of supposedly unfortunate medical accidents into a stark, undeniable pattern of predatory behavior. I explained that the canceled cardiology appointments, the isolated resort payments, the intercepted courier envelopes, and the forced institutionalization were all mechanical steps in a highly coordinated effort to hijack a commercial real estate transaction. Wade's defense attorney tried to object, attempting to paint my testimony as the paranoid conspiracy theory of a vindictive, separated spouse. But that strategy was instantly crushed by the sheer, mundane normality of our subsequent witnesses. Bryn took the stand, her voice shaking but resolute, and played the audio recording of Wade explicitly declaring that his father's actual mental state did not matter as long as the court believed the lie. Tessa Grady submitted a sworn, sealed affidavit confirming the deliberate falsification of the nursing observation charts to justify the heavy sedatives. Darlene Voss, looking exactly like the harmless octogenarian she was, provided the digital drive showing Wade moving heavy file boxes out of the house in the dead of night. They were not dramatic actors. They were ordinary people telling the plain truth, making it completely impossible for Wade to dismiss the evidence as a personal vendetta. The absolute room-freezing climax arrived when Lenora presented her final exhibit. She distributed copies of a commercial banking ledger she had secured late the previous night. She calmly explained to the magistrate that Wade had not just planned to profit from the guardianship, he had already weaponized the future expectation of the land sale to secure a massive personal bridge loan from a regional bank. His financial motive was no longer a speculative theory. It was written in black ink on a binding corporate loan agreement. He had attempted to sell his father's mine to cover his own catastrophic debts. The magistrate did not even need to recess to his chambers to deliberate. The ruling was instantaneous and brutally swift. He struck down the emergency guardianship petition with extreme prejudice. He ordered the immediate transfer of Wade's file to the county district attorney to initiate a formal criminal investigation into severe elder financial exploitation and fraud. Before banging his wooden gavel to dismiss the session, the judge granted Elias the floor to confirm, on the official legal record, the immediate and permanent removal of his son from any representational capacity regarding the family trust. The true poetic justice of the revenge unfolded later that exact same afternoon. At exactly 3 o'clock, the County Planning Commission publicly unsealed the master blueprints for the new regional transit corridor. The local news stations immediately began broadcasting the massive logistical expansion. Sitting in his lawyer's office, Wade finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his failure. The millions of dollars he had risked his marriage, his family, and his freedom to steal were now completely, legally locked inside the trust. And the only person on earth who held the legal authority to negotiate that multi-million-dollar commercial lease was me, the woman he had tried to discard. The final scene of this war did not feature screaming matches or shattered glass. The deepest cuts are always delivered in absolute silence. That evening, the Bellport air was crisp and biting. I helped Elias walk out onto the wooden front porch. I set down 2 ceramic plates holding the very last slices of his birthday bourbon pecan cake. We sat in the heavy wooden rocking chairs, the soft yellow light from the living room window spilling over our shoulders. Parked directly across the street, idling in the dark shadows of a large oak tree, was Wade's sedan. I could see the faint glow of the dashboard lights illuminating his pale, defeated face. He was sitting alone in his car, staring through the windshield at the house he had grown up in, the house he had plotted to conquer. Realizing he no longer possessed the right to even walk up the driveway, he was completely locked out of his own legacy. Elias took a slow bite of the sweet pecan crust. He looked across the dark street at the idling car, his expression holding no anger, only a quiet, profound pity. The greatest asset a man can build in this life is not a piece of commercial land, Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried over the gentle rustle of the winter leaves. The greatest asset is knowing exactly who will come back for you when you are left behind. I did not offer a reply. There were no more words required. I simply leaned back in my rocking chair, pulled my wool cardigan tighter against the chill, and let the cold night wind blow across the porch, knowing for the first time in my life that the battle was truly and completely over. Thank you so much for listening to this story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. And please make sure to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the content even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.